Thank you for joining us on Chill Sports History. Whether you're listening in the background just relaxing or settling in to fall asleep, we're very happy to have you here. And this is one of those stories that almost sounds made up when you say the basic version out loud. A brand new team arrives. Most people assume it will struggle. The roster is filled with players other teams were willing to expose. The season begins under deeply emotional and unusual circumstances. And then, almost immediately, the team starts winning. Not for a week or two. Not in the fun early way expansion teams sometimes do before the standings pull them back down. It keeps going. October becomes November. November becomes winter. Winter turns into spring. And somehow, this brand new team is still there. Still organized, still fast, still confident, and still making the entire league feel a little bit unreasonable. This time, we're looking back at the first season of the Vegas Golden Knights, and more specifically, at how a team that was never supposed to matter this quickly came within a few wins of the Stanley Cup. Because even now, years later, that season still carries a strange feeling around it. Part underdog run, part expansion story, part city story, part reminder that sometimes a team can take shape faster than anyone thinks it should. It was not a perfect team. It was not a dynasty in waiting. And by the end, it did not finish the job. But, for one season, it became one of the most improbable and memorable teams hockey has ever produced. So tonight, we're going to take our time with it and we're going to look back at how Vegas was built, why so many people underestimated it, how the roster found an identity, and how the Golden Knights got all the way to the Stanley Cup Final before the run finally slipped away. Because this is not just the story of a team that surprised people. It's the story of a team that kept winning long enough that surprise was no longer the right word. Before the games even began, the Golden Knights already felt unusual. Vegas was entering the NHL for the 2017 to 2018 season as the league's newest franchise. And expansion teams usually arrive with a certain accepted ceiling. They are expected to be interesting. They are expected to be messy. They are expected to lose a lot. That is just how these things are supposed to work. A team is assembled from players other organizations are willing to leave exposed in the expansion process. A few side deals are made, and then the new club spends a few years trying to become respectable. That was the normal script. Vegas never really followed it. General manager George McPhee and coach Gerard Gallant built something much better than most people realized at first. The roster did not look glamorous in the usual way, but it was full of legitimate players. Some had been buried on deeper teams. Some had not quite become what their original teams once hoped. Some were known more as useful pieces than as stars. But there was speed on the roster. There was structure. There was experience, and there was more scoring potential than many outsiders gave them credit for. And maybe most importantly, there were a lot of players with something to prove. That mattered. Expansion teams often struggle because they never quite build a believable identity in year one. Vegas found one almost immediately. They were quick. They attacked in waves. They got competent goaltending, and then much more than that. They defended hard. And they played with the kind of edge teams develop when a room is full of players who feel slightly overlooked. The names started to matter very quickly. Marc-Andre Fleury gave the team a real presence in goal. He was the biggest established name on the roster, and more than that, he gave the entire operation credibility. If you have a goalie like Fleury, the game can settle around him. A new team does not feel so fragile. Up front, Jonathan Marchessault and Riley Smith brought skill and pace. William Karlsson, who had never looked anything like a star scorer before, suddenly exploded into one. James Neal gave them finishing ability and experience. Erik Haula had his best offensive season. Alex Tuch added speed and size. On the blue line, Nate Schmidt moved the puck well. Shea Theodore kept growing into a bigger role, and Derek Engeland became an especially meaningful figure in the story of that first season. That does not read like the roster of a typical powerhouse. And in a sense, it wasn't. But it was the roster of a very good team. The league just needed some time to admit it. Then, before Vegas could even play its first home game, something happened that changed the emotional shape of the season. On October 1st, 2017, the city was shaken by the mass shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. That meant the Golden Knights began their first season not only as an expansion team, but as a team immediately tied to a grieving city. It is important to be careful with that part of the story, because sports cannot fix something like that. They cannot erase it. They cannot make it neat. But they can become part of how a city gathers itself in the days and weeks afterward. And the Golden Knights, almost before they fully knew who they were as a hockey team, became part of that process. Their home opener was no longer just the launch of a new franchise. It became something more solemn and more communal than that. Derek Engeland, who already had strong ties to Las Vegas, spoke at center ice before that first home game, and the night carried far more emotion than a normal October hockey game ever would. Then Vegas won, and that matters too. Not because one win can solve anything, but because the team did not feel detached from its city after that. It felt woven into it. That bond stayed with the season. The Golden Knights also started winning right away in purely hockey terms. They won their first game, then their second, then their first home game, which made them the first NHL expansion team to start 3-0. At that point, it still seemed like a fun early detail, a nice surprise, a good little story before reality settled in. But reality never really settled in the way people expected. Vegas kept playing well. They were fast through the neutral zone, opportunistic around the net, and much more organized defensively than a new team should have been. The Golden Knights did not play like a novelty. They played like a team with a real plan. And once that became clear, everything else got easier. Players understood their roles. The forechecks stayed aggressive. The top line began to punish teams. And perhaps the most surprising development of all was Karlsson. Before arriving in Vegas, he had 18 goals in 183 NHL games. In that inaugural season, he scored 43. That kind of leap changes the entire shape of a roster. Suddenly, the team does not just have depth. It has a genuine breakout star, and Karlsson was not doing it alone. Marchessault and Smith fit with him beautifully, and that line became one of the best stories in the league. They were quick, intelligent, and dangerous in a way that felt very hard to pin down. Vegas never needed to pretend to be heavy old playoff hockey all season long. It could pressure teams with speed and confidence. It could come at them in transition. It could turn one mistake into a scoring chance before the other team had fully reset itself. By the middle of the season, the whole thing had moved well beyond novelty. The Golden Knights were not hanging around the playoff picture by accident. They were near the top of the standings, and now the tone around them began to change. At first, they had been treated like a sweet story. Then they were treated like an overachieving one. Then, little by little, they had to be treated like a serious team. That is a very different thing. Once a team proves it can keep winning into the winter, the conversation shifts. The record means something. The structure means something. The confidence becomes harder to dismiss. Vegas kept earning that respect. By the end of the regular season, the Golden Knights had gone 51, 24, and 7 for 109 points, and won the Pacific Division. For an expansion team, that was absurd. For any team, it was excellent. Karlsson finished with 43 goals. Marchessault had 75 points. Smith had 60. Haula scored 29 goals. Fleury remained central to everything when healthy, and the larger shape of the team was now impossible to ignore. This was not smoke. This was not just a team riding emotion. This was a real contender. Even so, there was still a natural hesitation around them once the playoffs began. The Stanley Cup playoffs are different. A nice regular season can disappear quickly. An expansion team, no matter how good, still felt like the sort of team that might finally run into the weight of playoff hockey and lose in a round or two. If Vegas had gone out early, the season still would have been remembered as a remarkable success. But the Golden Knights were not finished. Their first playoff opponent was the Los Angeles Kings. That was an interesting test because Los Angeles had recent championship credibility and the heavier, more familiar look of a playoff team. If there was a moment where Vegas might have been expected to look new, this felt like it. The Kings had won Stanley Cups not long before. They knew how playoff hockey was supposed to feel. They were comfortable in low-scoring games, comfortable in tense games, comfortable in the kind of series where one bounce can sit in everybody's memory for a week. That made them a useful measuring stick. If Vegas was only a strong regular season story, the Kings felt like the kind of opponent who would expose that. Instead, the Golden Knights swept the series. That alone changed everything. They did not just survive their first playoff round, they controlled it. Game 1 set the tone. Vegas won 1-0, and the whole night had the feeling of a team settling itself into the playoffs rather than nervously entering them. There was no rush to prove anything dramatically, no panic, no visible sense that this was all happening too fast. They simply played their game and trusted it. Game 2 was even tighter, another 2-1 win, and now the series was moving to Los Angeles with Vegas already looking more composed than a first-year team had any right to look. That is one of the things worth remembering about that run. The Golden Knights were exciting, yes, but they were not reckless. They could play close games, they could protect a lead, they could let Fleury turn the game into something narrow and nerve-wracking for the other team. By the time Game 3 went to overtime, there was a real sense that Los Angeles was being slowly squeezed. William Karlsson scored the winner, Vegas took a 3-0 series lead, and the whole series began to feel tilted in a way that should not have happened against a team with that much playoff history. Then came Game 4, another 1-0 win, another shutout for Fleury, and suddenly the Golden Knights had not just won their first playoff series, they had swept it with startling authority. Fleury was brilliant and posted 2 shutouts in the series, including that final 1-0 win that sent Vegas through without a loss. Now the feeling around the team began to change again. This was no longer just a successful expansion season. This was a team doing things no expansion team was supposed to do in the playoffs. The second round brought the San Jose Sharks, a deeper and more dangerous opponent. And for a moment, this felt like it might be where things finally evened out. San Jose was skilled, experienced, and much more explosive offensively than Los Angeles. If the Kings series had been about surviving weight and structure, this one looked more like a test of whether Vegas could keep winning once the games opened up a little. But Game 1 blew that idea apart. Vegas won 7-0. It was one of those results that does more than give a team a series lead. It completely changes the emotional space of the matchup. The Sharks were an accomplished team. Vegas made them look overwhelmed. And because it happened in round 2, after the Kings sweep had already made people pay attention, the message landed much harder. The Golden Knights were not just surviving good teams, they were imposing themselves on them. Game 2 stayed with Vegas as well, and when the series shifted to San Jose, the Sharks finally pushed back. Game 3 went to overtime, which felt important. This was the kind of swing game that can change a series. A home team trying to pull itself back into the fight. A road team trying to prove it can absorb the push. Jonathan Marchessault scored the overtime winner, and that goal may have been one of the quiet turning points of the whole playoff run. Instead of a 2-1 series with the Sharks finding life, it became 3-0 and almost impossible for San Jose to fully recover. Vegas eventually built that 3-0 series lead, and even when San Jose pushed back with 2 straight wins, Vegas did not unravel. That is one of the most impressive things about that team. For all the speed and looseness in the way it played, it was not a fragile group. When the pressure rose, it usually steadied itself, and there is something psychologically important about that in the playoffs. A team can surprise opponents for a round, it can even ride a hot streak through a couple of weeks. But once adversity shows up, once a series that looks secure starts to wobble, you find out whether the team actually trusts itself. Vegas did. In Game 6, Fleury delivered a shutout. Vegas won 3-0, and the Golden Knights were moving on again. At this point, the season had entered a different kind of space. People were no longer asking whether the Golden Knights were real. Now they were asking how far this could possibly go. The Western Conference Final set them against the Winnipeg Jets, another excellent story and another very good team. Winnipeg had speed, skill, and one of the loudest buildings in hockey. They also had a little more of the feel people expect from a team on the edge of a Stanley Cup Final. There was star power there. There was force. There was the sense of a club arriving at the right time. The Jets won Game 1, which gave the series a slightly more normal shape. Maybe this would finally be the moment Vegas got pushed backward, and for a night, that seemed plausible. The building in Winnipeg was roaring. The Jets had landed the first blow. The series had finally given the Golden Knights a script that looked ordinary. Instead, Vegas answered immediately. They won Game 2 on the road, which quieted the building and took away the clean, emotional edge Winnipeg had created. That road win mattered a great deal because it restored the feeling that Vegas did not need ideal conditions. The Golden Knights could reset a series almost instantly. They could absorb a punch and then make the other team feel uneasy again. Back in Vegas, the Golden Knights won Game 3 by a score of 4-2. And that game is remembered in part for one of Fleury's most famous moments of the entire run, the sprawling stick save on Mark Scheifele that somehow kept the puck out. It was the kind of save that does more than preserve a goal. It seems to preserve a season's feeling. When a run is this improbable, it needs a few images that come to symbolize the whole thing. That save was one of them. Game 4 went to Vegas as well, and now the Golden Knights were in a position that still felt almost ridiculous to describe. A first-year team led 3-1 in the Western Conference Final. Then, in Game 5 in Winnipeg, Ryan Reaves scored the go-ahead goal in the second period, and the Golden Knights closed the series with a 2-1 win. That is such a fitting little detail for that team. Not because Reaves was a central scorer, but because Vegas kept getting meaningful moments from all over the lineup. The roster was never built around one overwhelming superstar carrying the whole story. It was built around pressure, speed, belief, and players stepping into exactly the right moments. And just like that, they were Western Conference champions. That is the point where the season fully passed out of normal sports language. Even calling it a Cinderella run did not quite fit, because fairy tales usually imply fragility. Vegas did not feel fragile. It felt fast, opportunistic, and disturbingly comfortable in huge games. It had now eliminated Los Angeles, San Jose, and Winnipeg. None of that was luck, none of that was just the crowd, and if there was one player who seemed to embody the whole run, it was Fleury. He had already won Stanley Cups in Pittsburgh, so unlike the franchise around him, he carried history into the moment. But there was something lovely about how he fit this team. He was experienced without making the story feel old. He was emotional without seeming rattled. And through the first 3 rounds, he looked like the leading candidate for the Conn Smythe Trophy. That made sense. Great playoff runs often need a goalie who turns tight games into something a team can believe in. Vegas had that. And now came the Stanley Cup Final. The opponent was the Washington Capitals, a team carrying its own kind of history and pressure. Washington had spent years being one of the NHL's best regular season teams without finishing the job. Alex Ovechkin was still chasing the one thing missing from his career. So the matchup had an interesting shape to it. One team was brand new and had arrived far too early. The other had been trying to arrive for years. There was a different emotional weight on each side. Vegas was playing inside a dream. Washington was trying to finally end one long frustration. Game 1 in Vegas was wild and open, and the Golden Knights won 6-4. That felt enormous. It gave them the early lead. It fed the idea that maybe this impossible season still had more room to keep going. And because of who Vegas was, every win in that final felt slightly bigger than usual. A normal contender taking a 1-0 series lead is just a normal part of June hockey. An expansion team taking a 1-0 series lead in the Cup Final felt like the sport drifting toward fantasy. There was also a looseness to that opener that seemed to favor Vegas. The game was not careful. It moved. It opened up. It let the Golden Knights play the kind of confident attacking hockey that had carried them all year. But then Washington answered. The Capitals won Game 2 in Vegas, then took Games 3 and 4 in Washington. And this is where the final part of the Vegas story becomes especially interesting. The Golden Knights did not collapse. They were still in games. They were still threatening. But the final began to show the limits of what they were. Washington was heavier at key moments, more settled in the rhythm of the series. more able to survive the swings. Vegas had spent almost the entire season being the team that caught everyone slightly off balance. By the final, the Capitals were able to absorb that and keep playing. The Golden Knights also got less from their top scorers as the series went on. And that matters in June. It is one thing to come at teams in waves through the regular season and first 3 rounds. It is another to keep doing it once every mistake is magnified and every line is studied in detail. Washington also had the feel of a team that was finally done being nervous about its own history. Once the Capitals recovered from losing Game 1, they looked calmer with each passing night. And that calm was hard for Vegas to shake. By Game 5, Vegas was trying to extend the season at home, and for a while it looked possible. The Golden Knights led 3-2 after 2 periods. The building was alive. The season was still breathing. And that is part of what makes the ending work emotionally even now. It was still there, still close enough to imagine, still one strong period away from forcing the series back to Washington. But in the 3rd period, the Capitals scored twice. Lars Eller got the go-ahead goal. Washington won 4-3. And just like that, the Golden Knights' first season was over. But emotionally, the story feels a little different than that. Because the 2017 to 2018 Golden Knights are not remembered mainly as a team that lost the Stanley Cup Final in 5 games. They are remembered as the team that made the final in the first place. They are remembered as the expansion team that somehow skipped the usual years of struggle. They are remembered for becoming part of the emotional life of their city almost immediately. They are remembered for Karlsson's breakout, for Marchessault and Smith flying up the ice, for Fleury smiling through save after save, for Gallant standing behind the bench with that calm, slightly amused expression, and for a building that seemed to realize faster than anyone else that this team was not just a temporary thrill. And they are remembered because the whole thing happened in such a clear, clean rush. There was no long build-up, no slow climb over 5 or 6 years, no gradual rise from lottery team to contender. Vegas showed up and was immediately relevant. That is part of why the season still feels so vivid. Most great team stories take time to harden. This one arrived all at once. There is also something very appealing about the composition of that roster when you look back on it. It was not a conventional collection of superstars. It was a team of excellent fits. Players who found the right environment at the right moment. Players who had been useful elsewhere and became more important together. An expansion season built not on one giant miracle, but on many smaller ones that kept aligning. Karlsson scoring 43 goals. Haula having a career year. Marchessault and Smith fitting perfectly. Fleury staying brilliant. The whole team buying into Gallant's pace and structure. Put enough of those together, and what once looked improbable starts to look earned. That is probably the most satisfying way to remember the Golden Knights that year. Not as a fluke, not as some random burst of luck that hockey never quite explained, but as a genuinely good team that came together faster than the sport knew how to talk about. And maybe that is why the ending, while disappointing, never fully swallowed the season. A lot of near-championship teams end up remembered mostly for the final loss. The loss matters, of course. If they had found a way past Washington, the story would have become one of the most astonishing championship runs in North American sports. But even without that last step, the team still kept the larger miracle intact. It still made the final. It still changed what people thought an expansion team could be. It still gave the city one of the most meaningful first seasons any franchise has ever had. And in a strange way, the fact that they fell just short may even preserve the story in its most dramatic form. Because they did not simply have a good first year, they nearly did the impossible. That is a stronger memory, a sharper one, a story people keep returning to because it stays perched right on the edge between what happened and what almost happened. Thank you for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the first season of the Vegas Golden Knights, and at one of hockey's most improbable almost championships. It's a story about a new team, a city finding something to rally around, and a season that moved so quickly from curiosity to belief that it never really had time to feel ordinary. And maybe that is the nicest way to remember it, not as a perfect ending, not even as a normal one. just as a season that arrived caught hold and stayed far longer in the imagination than anyone could have expected when it began. Thanks so much for joining on Chill Sports History. We love sharing these fun stories with you every week. If you'd like to come back for another story, we'd be very happy to have you here, and we can't wait to share more with you.